Thank you, David. I'm joined by three industry leaders from diverse organizational backgrounds to discuss how best to enact appropriate AI regulations without inhibiting critical innovation. What should the priorities be? Let me introduce Jeff Naveda, Vice President of Quality and Regulatory Affairs at Viz.ai, Dr. David Rue, Global Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Healthcare at Microsoft, Akshay Sharma, the Chief AI Officer at Lyric, and regrettably, a fourth panelist, Sean Wong, the Chief Data Science and AI Officer for Elevance Health, had a last-minute emergency. We are sorry he will not be able to join the discussion with our group. Welcome. We have a lot to discuss. Let's get to our first question. So my first question is, understanding where we are right now in the development of AI, which regulatory approach or piece of regulation do you fear the most? Let's start with David. David, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Zach. I think it's important that we all express our concerns, but sometimes our concerns can lead to fears, and the fears can lead to overreaction, which can then lead to broad sweeping policies that are not well thought out and could potentially cause some significant harm. And I think one of those broad sweeping policies would be if we were to say, we need to stop and pause all AI, and that actually could cause significant harm. And largely it's because we are already doing AI today. Now, some may call this more traditional algorithmic predictive algorithms, but it is in place, it is being used, and is being used to help patients and improve the quality and safety of patient care. So I think it would be a misstep if we were to kind of jump to that conclusion. I mean, one of the things we are starting to recognize is that the combination of some of this newer generative AI, specifically the large language models, are giving us an opportunity to understand some new capabilities. But we should also recognize that it's continuing to get better and better. And so we shouldn't be making conclusions about what this is based on what we see today. It's only going to get better, and it's going to continue to make less errors. And there are now organizations across the country that are looking at ways that we can build in those guardrails and enable us to be able to have safe and trustworthy AI implemented in healthcare.
Great. Jeff, what's your take?
Yeah, for me, it's more about ensuring that we don't have double regulation. We already have most of the AI algorithms that are used in healthcare today are regulated by FDA. And my biggest fear would be to have yet another agency or two more or three more, right? Having something to say about how to regulate these devices, where we already have to comply with rules from the FDA to ensure that these products are safe and effective. Another piece that I think we should think about is who is actually creating these regulations. I wouldn't like people who doesn't know about AI creating a regulation for something that they completely distrust. They don't know how it works. So I fear that, or the reality is that I think we should have experts in the field doing these regulations and sharing their knowledge to ensure that we have proper laws for it.
Akshay, what do you think?
It's a great question, because I think I would start by saying that premature regulation is dangerous as well. What we're actually seeing is that there are some sort of talks about regulating based on the amount of compute, especially with generative AI, or the size of a language model. And to me, that's premature, because I think we're very early in the game. We don't know what the next 10 years would look like at the speed at which it could grow. So trying to regulate that without knowing the consequences of like how good or beneficial this AI could be, that's one thing. The second thing I would say is this idea that every generative AI app has to be approved by a committee before it can be launched to an audience. I think that's also sort of very early or premature set of regulation. The thesis that I have is that, at the point where we will have very good AI, it could come through different means, like small language models, or a combination of many small models could be as good as a large language model. So we need to think more holistically, and we're very early, and so avoid premature regulations.
Yeah, just my own 2 cents. I'm worried about regulation that does not take into account the benefit that patients have already acquired through these models. And especially in an era just in the United States where we have a primary care system that's disintegrating. These tools are already being used. And I think the patient voice, particularly of those patients who are benefiting from these new models, is absolutely essential. And they're not really part of the conversation yet. And that's part of the maturation I would like to see. So let's flip it around. I'll go back to David. David, what regulation or piece of legislation do you fear most we might not actually implement or discuss?
If we look back in terms of prior technology implementations, we can see some patterns and some lessons learned. And every successful implementation has involved three components: technology, process, and people. Selection of the right technology for the right process and the use case. Identification of how we can best implement this in a workflow with the right safeguards, and enabling people to understand how to use those safeguards and be able to apply the technologies. So in terms of technology use cases, I'm concerned that we may not appreciate that we have a transformative agent that can allow us to be able to address some of the biggest challenges we see in healthcare today. We're talking about clinician burnout with use of things like ambient clinical intelligence, the ability to provide access to affordable healthcare for underserved populations by using AI as a pre-screening tool to identify these high-risk patients, to improve the efficiency and remove the waste from the systems. We know there's a tremendous amount of that within healthcare today, and allowing us to be able to address this. Let's not just simply automate broken processes with AI, but let's reinvent the optimal way to provide care, leveraging these new tools that we have available. So that's one of the things that I'm concerned that we may underpunch. And in terms of the implementation, I'm concerned that we may not recognize just how challenging it can be to really measure the impact of the AI, because a lot of times what we're talking about is the integrated role of how AI fits into a workflow. So the implementation is critical. Sometimes we assume that just simply we saw an outcome and the AI was implemented, that was the result. There are many factors. And so this is going to be a challenge, and we may not recognize it. So if we think about these parameters and these rules, we have to think about all the elements of how the outcomes came about. And when we think about outcomes, we have to also understand that there are many unanticipated outcomes that we have to keep in mind. So these are things that we will oftentimes, as we go down this path, realize that we just don't know what we don't know today. And also equity, just making sure that we think about how we can ensure that not only does it work, but does it work for everybody. And lastly, I think that we have to start thinking about how we skill and reskill an entire workforce. And that includes patients, it includes providers, it includes regulators, all about how we can utilize these new tools in a way that we feel confident is going to lead to the safest and best care for everyone.
I fully agree, and actually, it's a chance for me to self-interestedly advertise the role that the NEJM AI wishes to have to evaluate many of these tools, how they affect, not in the abstract, but in actual workflow, clinical care, among the other points they've made. Jeff, what's your fear about something that we may be missing out on regulating, or some piece of legislation that we should be considering?
Yeah, I think my biggest fear would be around allowing general purpose AI to percolate the usage in a clinical workspace, creating some sort of situation where we have, public safety issues and patient safety issues because these algorithms are not fit for purpose, right? Are not trained, are not fine-tuned to healthcare settings. And my fear is actually not only allowing these algorithms to be used, but also the reactivity that could create, that could end up creating more regulations for other, more fine-tuned, more specialized tools that we're already using in healthcare. I think that is something that I don't know exactly how to do it. That is something that requires a bigger discussion, but definitely having having software or AIs that are not for the purpose of healthcare, involving healthcare settings and not properly tested, that would be a big miss, in my opinion.
That's very well said, and I'm reminded around the time when the Human Genome Project was completed, many business models came out, including consumer genetic testing. And for a while, it wasn't obvious to everybody, but the fact that the probabilities of disease for healthy individuals is very different than those for sick individuals with those same variants. And so having proper in-context vetting, we don't want to, for example, trigger chains of evaluations that are just misfires. That's very different than when a patient at home uses a generative AI just in the way they used search before, as in Dr. Google, because then they still have that filter function of the clinician saying, well, you don't want to do that, that's dangerous, or you might mislead us. So I think that vetting is extremely important, and not least of which, considering the cyber warfare concerns, we also want well-vetted systems to be incorporated if they're dealing, to be tested if they're dealing with the rest of the machinery within hospitals' walls. Akshay.
Yeah, and I would say, continuing on the same thought, I think there are parts where this AI can be used, and without oversight, it can be used for decision making in healthcare that can be harmful. Harmful in the sense of there is no transparency around how the decision was made, and if there are no good controls around how the AI was developed, and if there were no humans in the loop to sort of validate and vet the system before going to production, and if the decisions from the AI are not to some extent explainable, and this matters quite a bit in healthcare and sort of the overarching healthcare ecosystem, including insurance, it can lead to sort of decisions that are harmful for patients, right? So for me, I think it's important to focus on how are we bringing this AI systems to production, regulating that aspect of it, and not sort of being prescriptive of how that should be done, but more in terms of checks and balances that can be brought in. Because I think the opportunity we have with this AI, especially with generative AI and large language models and the plethora of those type of models, is we can assure a humanist era. So we can give back time for providers, patients, so that they can focus on care as opposed to doing the chore in the system. So, but doing it right takes a little bit of effort, and I think that's really what should be regulated.
So, David, forgive me if this is an unfair question, because we are in very early days of deployment. But what most of our audience may not realize, for example, is that GPT-4 is available in two different forms. One is directly from OpenAI as ChatGPT, and the other is through the Azure platform, where you serve multiple healthcare systems, among others. How are you thinking about some of these issues around using these very powerful models within the confines of healthcare systems? Is there additional thinking that has to go into that?
Absolutely. And one of the things that it's important to recognize is when people go to a website and they start typing in and leveraging this information, and they're entering information in their the prompts that they're entering in, maybe the documents that they're uploading, all of that's going into the public domain. That's something people need to be aware of when they go to these websites. However, when you use an enterprise solution that is within your own tenant, you have an ability to be able to do things that are entirely private and secure within that organization. You can manage confidential data, patient data. You can manage highly sensitive data. And neither the prompts nor the data ever get exposed outside of that tenant. That's really important that people understand that, because that's the reason why businesses can feel confident in terms of being able to leverage these tools. Now, the other thing is that we, and there's many ways that this can be done, but certainly the one way that Microsoft has done it is that the information never gets back outside of that original model that is applied. It is not coming back to Microsoft or to OpenAI. It just remains there. So, there's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage, obviously, is from a privacy perspective. That information never comes back to us. Now, I guess the disadvantage is that we're not constantly learning from all the things that people are doing, so we're not updating the models based on your own learnings. But, again, that's one of the things that we have recognized is essential in enterprise. You have to maintain that privacy, that security that allows people to feel confident that they can utilize these tools in ways that will protect their business and the data that they're trying to manage.
So, David, let's say I'm a doctor at a community hospital. How do I know if I'm using one of those tenant systems versus one that there's no guarantees about where my data goes? How do I know?
Well, I think you'd have to first work with your technology division to see, first of all, are you going on the internet and accessing it? Then you're likely using a consumer version. If you're using it through your enterprise, let's say your organization has said, here's the site that you can access that. Then I think you're going to have to ask them how they're doing it, and in all likelihood, they'll probably be using the enterprise version. But that's something that oftentimes need to be managed at the enterprise level.
So I'm going to mix it up and dare to go in a different direction. Akshay, from your perspective, what special things from your perspective and company's perspective do you have to worry about in clinical deployments?
Great question. I think privacy is the top priority from how we deal with it. So the way I see it in healthcare is that every company has an information advantage. What I would call that as private data that's very specific to every enterprise. And there's a lot of literature and knowledge that's been historically built with that enterprise. Now, that is not available in any of the publicly available models or even open source trained models, because that information is the information advantage every enterprise has. So when we build stuff, we are actually fine tuning, if not training models that learns the enterprise knowledge. And that needs to be safeguarded and preserved. And as Dave was saying, it's basically, like how do we use tools and environments where this is not leaking to the public, right? So when we build models and fine-tune models and deploy models, we do it on sort of our knowledge base, but then we take that to our customer and sort of enhance it with customers' own data and stays private with the customer. So that's really what our focus is.
So if I'm one of your customers, you're not going to mingle my data with another one of your customers, or will you?
Absolutely not. So I think there are two levels of avoiding data commingling. So my company has its sound knowledge base built over 25 years. But then when we go to a customer, we use customers' own data and do it in the local environments that they want, like, for example, their cloud or on-prem, and deploy it just for them. And we don't mingle that between customers. And also there is another level, which is the patient data itself. So we don't want to train on patient data, definitely not directly. And we spend a lot of time trying to de-identify the data, get it certified, and only then we can use those data sets. And that takes a lot of effort, but I think that's really worthy to do it because models can leak information, especially when you poison them or reverse them. So we are very mindful of that.
That's a lot of effort. I can tell you that the journal itself is trying to promote sharing of these de-identified data sets because they're so expensive to generate. And so as part of our benchmark data set article types, we encourage submissions that include those, both the data, like a text, and the expert annotations. But it's expensive, so hear you loud and clear. Jeff, what's your take on this? How to navigate that hospital healthcare system versus public divide?
In my experience, what I see happening every day is that because we're heavily regulated already, we have to have a stringent quality management system for all of the activities, starting from the development of the device to checking what's happening with the device post-market. So, and we have to comply with HIPAA. We have to comply with GDPR if we are deploying in Europe, right? So I can tell you from my experience, we have already a lot of checks and balances to ensure that the product is safe, effective, and also the privacy is maintained for the customers and patients. So the challenge is actually ensuring that all the companies are actually doing the same, right? Which is in the case of HIPAA, for example, HIPAA, even though it's law, it's not, nobody's actually checking for HIPAA. It's more reactive. It happens after there's a breach where you have to go and report it and see what happened and all of that. I think that the challenge here would be, how do we proactively ensure that there is more safety measures around the privacy of the data? With the device itself, Zach, I honestly don't see any, like, if you are already in a regulated environment, you already have to comply with a lot of rules that you get audited on a yearly basis. So I think it's all well taken care of.
Well, I think it's interesting because I think you are very regulated as an industry, but because large language models in particular have been such a splash, not only patients, but doctors are in some sense, in many cases, ahead of the implementation in their healthcare system. And as a result, I remember early on, maybe January or February of 2023, seeing doctors tweeting and bragging about a very nice thing, which is they're taking the patient note and they're dumping it into their iPhones and saying, write me a letter of prior authorization, requiring prior authorization. And it did it, boom, in a second. And on the one hand, I was very happy for these doctors to have saved themselves minutes of time. It seemed I was wincing because that ChatGPT implementation is the one that goes directly to OpenAI, not through Microsoft, and so it has no HIPAA provisioning whatsoever. So technically, they were in HIPAA violation. And I do think there's a risk that if their healthcare systems do not figure out soon the governance and a way to bring to bear these tools, doctors are going to take things into their own hand, and they will not be under the same kind of regulatory environment. They will be, but they won't be acting as if they are, because they'll be using these phones as if they were out there in the civilian world, so to speak. So I think that's a very serious concern that I don't think the hospitals quite yet realize they're going to have to address. So having said that, I'm curious, do you see currently, I think we're running out of time, so just a few comments from each of you. Is this legislation, are the concerns being pursued more actively right now in the EU or in the United States? Jeff, what do you think?
I think what I'm seeing with the EU, they're definitely a bit ahead in terms of trying to put some framework around what needs to happen. What I've seen in my experience in the US is more theoretical. We shall try to do these things, right, without really saying what is it that you need to do, more like mandating, go ahead and regulate. I would say the EU is a little bit more advanced in that sense. So it's time to catch up.
Yeah. As you know, President Biden put out an executive order around AI. It was more about telling people, get your ducks in a row. You need to have a chief AI officer, get the expertise in the House. And it was not that prescriptive, except for perhaps some of the things that actually pointed out about total compute, which I thought was perhaps something that would not last the test of time. David, where are you seeing the most activity internationally on regulation?
Yeah, so if I were to say internationally, EU and the US are definitely in the forefront. Now, one could argue, is one ahead or behind? It's a little difficult to say based on, whether or not you agree with the policies. But I'd say just in terms of thinking about how AI can be a transformative agent and how we need to implement trustworthy and responsible AI principles and operationalize them, both are kind of in that category. I've been spending time with other parts of the world, in particular LATAM and APAC, definitely thinking about it, but really only in selected institutions across those areas, not necessarily on a wide scale basis. Now, one thing that I have seen that I am highly positive about and encouraging is that there is also a thought that it's not just going to be regulators that are going to figure this out, but it's going to be through public-private partnerships, identifying how we can work together a new sense of shared responsibilities between not just developers and regulators, but also including implementers, to start looking at post-deployment assessment of outcomes, being able to look for drift, being able to assess, to understand how this can be applied more generalizable to low resource settings. These are things that will benefit everyone. And so as we move forward, it'll be exciting to see how we're able to develop regulations that will be helpful, but also easily implemented by any institution and any organization across the world.
So Akshay, I'd like your take on that. And I don't know if you had that experience yet in the mid-level developing world. Like, does India have the beginnings of regulation? What's your experience?
Yeah, and I think just to answer the question, I wouldn't say one is ahead of the other. I think EU definitely has more prescriptive sort of regulation and policies. US obviously has kept it a lot more broad and wants to decentralize those things. And being in healthcare, we have to be on top of this anyway. So one other thing in the US that I really liked is in the Biden's mandate that came out was the watermarking some of the output, right? So this is actually very useful between trusted parties. So imagine a provider, your prior auth thing. If a provider is using prior auths to be generated from GPT, I think that can be watermarked. And on the other side, if that's a payer looking at it, they know that it's coming from a watermark system, and it could be a Gen AI on the other side reading that as well, right? So, and in an untrusted network, you will have to look beyond just like things like blockchain and others may come in effect. So we can build trust without actually getting trust out of the box. Now, looking at developing markets, I think one of the things that I saw in India, which was the point I was making earlier, is this idea that there is a central system that will actually approve of every Gen AI app. I think that's not a scalable way, and I think that again goes back to who's in that team, and that sort of limits innovation that can come out of it, right? So to me, that's going backwards. But I'm hoping that those things will change, because I think innovators are everywhere around the world. That the good thing about this AI is that you can be anywhere and build something very valuable for changing things. So I think I'm hoping that around the world we'll see a common sense sort of prevailing.
Yeah, I have quite a few colleagues here at Harvard whose parents came from India, and they themselves are involved in AI. And they said that when that came out from India, they said, "Oh, they're going to slow down deployment by years." But I'm sure it's only the first round, and there could be revision. People see what happens. So listen, I want to thank you all. This has been really a wonderful discussion. Unfortunately, our time is up. It went as fast as I predicted it would be. And so thank you all. And I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. Now it's time for me to introduce David Ouyang, physician and assistant professor at the Department of Cardiology at Cedars-Sinai, who's going to take on the next session.